Welcome back to Cutting the Distance. Today's guest has been able to combine his two passions of bow hunting and mechanical engineering into designing and producing some of the best broadheads available today. Bill Vanderheyden has been bow hunting for 40 years. He grew up hunting whitetails in Wisconsin before moving to Colorado 24 years ago. He still hunts whitetails, but his focus is now primarily on western big game, with backcountry elk hunting being his absolute favorite. He's been a mechanical engineer for 30 years with an emphasis on mechanical design and materials science. He's developed products for other companies for many years, including high-tech, aerospace, and medical devices before starting Iron Will Outfitters and focusing completely on broadheads and aero components just recently. He's also an adjunct instructor of mechanical engineering at University of Colorado, where he's currently sponsoring and directing projects related to the science of bow hunting. So welcome to the show, Bill.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me on.
I know you just returned from a bear hunt up in Canada. It looked like a great time with some great results. Go ahead and give us a little snapshot into that hunt.
Yeah, I've been going up to Saskatchewan in the spring for, I think it's my fourth trip up there in the last 5 or 6 years, and just seeing some giant bears. And I got a good one last year, but this year was just a tank of a bear, 473 pound. And man, my heart was beating hard when I saw him coming through the woods. But yeah, a great bear, just huge.
Yeah, the pictures were impressive, and a lot of times on bears, it seems like pictures don't do them justice. So I can only imagine how big that guy was. But yeah, for upper fours, if we're getting into that almost 500 range, that is a giant. So congrats on that. No, appreciate having you on. We're going to talk a lot about what I consider the killing end of the stick for a lot of us archery hunters, and so I'm really excited. But like every episode, we're going to jump in to listener questions or some questions that I was able to scrounge up that people had, knowing that I was going to have you on a guest today. So like every episode, if you have questions for me or my guest, please submit them to us at ctd@phelpsgamecalls.com or send us a message on social, and we'll do our best to get them included. So I've got 5 or 6 questions here. Once again, I went to the Is It September Yet Facebook page, group, a bunch of diehard archery elk hunters. And so I've got a list of questions I'm going to throw at you here, Bill.
Sounds good.
So I don't know if there's a science to it, but we're going to call this first question. Can you explain kind of the science of a good blood trail? This question comes to us from Derek Klein from Is It September Yet?
Yeah, I'd say there's kind of probably 3 factors there. There's, shot placement. Did you slice? Are your blades able to slice all the way through? And then, what's the shape and size of the holes, really? And so shot placement is going to be number one. If you get the heart lung area and you got a low exit hole, probably going to be a great blood trail. If you're hitting a high back lung shot, just below the spine, high and back, those can be not so good.
Yep.
You got, the blood's got to flow down the sides of the animal. Also, you cut the top of the lung, but that kind of shrinks down. Not a lot of bleeding coming from that. You shoot a gut shot, maybe that, often the guts can kind of plug the hole, and the stuff coming out might not be bright red. It might be kind of more brownish or something. So that can be tough too. So shot placement is probably number one. But if you just get into the broadheads, then the bigger and the more open the hole is going to generally give a better blood trail. So just a 2-blade slice can sometimes close up and give you a really poor blood trail, even if the slicing was kind of good through the middle. They can be good, but that's kind of a potential issue with just a straight 2-blade. A 3-blade can give you more of a hole then, because it's not a single slice that can close up. You've got more of a maybe triangular shape inside. And I would put a 2-blade with bleeders in that same category. You get a cross cut there. Inside corners can't really stay tensioned, so they pull back, and there's a bit of a hole there. In a single bevel with the rotation, and I prefer a single bevel with bleeders, with that rotation, that can give more of almost a square hole, because of that rotation, the way it cuts through the hide. So that hole opens up holes nicely. But the other factor, and I would also say, kind of bigger the better. Our wide broadhead series gives a wider cut than our standard, and in general is going to give more more blood getting out of the animal, more tissue is sliced as you go through. But one other factor that a lot of people don't think about is that sharpness and edge retention is really important as well, I believe. I've done some testing where you just push the different broadheads through, say, like a liver or a lung, of an animal after you get it, and you can see that with ironwood broadheads that are very sharp with good edge retention, you get that complete cut of the sides of the head as it goes through. It's slicing everything. It's not really pushing tissue aside. Whereas a lot of heads, they're with cheaper blades, those edges are dull by the time they get through the hide and for sure rib. And so they push a lot of tissue aside after that. Don't slice it. So there's a lot less bleeding involved.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I just relate the sharpness to, when you cut yourself with a brand new razor, it seems like it takes forever to stop bleeding. And so I've always felt sharpness, but then like you said, keeping that thing sharp, we've all ran our knife through hide, we've all ran our knives, along a bone, and it doesn't take very long. So that the initial sharpness, but then the ability to hold that through as it gets through the animal or out the other side, in my opinion, is one of those like very important aspects to have that exit hole bleeding. And have you found, or I mean, it's very tough to do, but a lot of times we get more blood out of that exit side. This is something I've always talked about. Your exit hole on a broadhead always seems to be bigger, and I'm going to let you clear up anything I say that may be a mistake here. But when you on your entry side, let's say you have a rib cage that's backing the hide, it almost guarantees that since there's no stretch to that hide, you're going to get a hole that's the exact size of your broadhead, unless you come in at an angle, but you're basically going to get a mirror of your broadhead that goes in. But on the opposite side, that hide will stretch a little bit depending on the sharpness and the angle and whatnot. And as you imagine that hide stretching over the broadhead before it finally starts to slice, you typically will get that bigger exit side. And growing up or everything, you always, the exit hole is always bigger. They bleed more out of that. Have you found that to be true? Or are they very similar?
I think that's probably true in general, that the exit holes seem to be a little bigger than entrance. With single bevels, I'd say that it seems to not be the case so much, because that rotation on entrance and the way it's twisting and cutting, I see kind of more similar. It's pretty open hole on both sides.
Gotcha.
With those, with the single bevel with bleeders.
Yep. And we'll get into it here in a little bit. One of the reasons I like actually a narrower head is to ensure that I get those two holes if I do everything right on my side, which isn't necessarily, it doesn't relate back to the lethality of the broadhead. The animal's probably still going to die. It's my ability to get more evidence on the ground, so I can track the thing to its final location and not necessarily lose it. Around here, we've got a bunch of needles or old growth they may run into, and the more blood we can get on the ground, the better. And then one other thing I was going to touch, you'd mentioned like a high lung shot, and the result of bloods. We've hit a lot of animals high lung, and I will say, once again, they die maybe faster than other ones because it does fill up their lungs with blood very quickly and does the killing through that mechanism. But yeah, very, very little blood. Now, it is a great shot if, to very quick and ethical, but doesn't yield very good blood. So it's that balance of, hitting them there versus getting a blood trail. So I'll diverge on that topic. We're going to get into penetration and some of the other things that I personally look for on big, Western big game. But no, thanks for answering Derek Klein's question there on blood trail sharpness, 2, 3, or 4 blades. I think we covered it all there. Now, there was one thing I'm going to add to this. Do you find any difference in blood trails, single to double bevel? Does that affect, aside from what you've already mentioned, that entry hole, or would you say that regardless of the angle of the blade and all of that, they yield pretty similar blood trails, everything else being equal?
I would say with a 2-blade head, if you have a 2-blade without bleeder, and you compare a double bevel to a single bevel, I would give single bevel a little advantage there, because there's kind of an S cut as it rotates in. So it's not really a straight slit like you get with a straight 2-blade without bleeders. And then once you add the bleeders on a single bevel and get that rotation, it does I mean, if you look at the holes through the hide on both sides, they are more open with that rotation. Um, I would say that I'm seeing good blood trails with both. Really, our double bevel with the bleeder, and then our single bevel with the bleeder. There's a lot of cutting going on, and the holes are opening up both sides. I think they both do really well. I might give a little advantage though to the single bevel with bleeder, just because of the way it opens up those holes, especially the entrance hole.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. So thanks for that. We're going to jump into the next question here. Can you explain the warranty of iron will broadheads and kind of what that covers and what led you to that warranty?
Yeah, so the reason for that initially was that I spent many years trying to design and develop a broadhead that would cut through bone and stay sharp, not get damaged. Get you through that shoulder bone on an elk. Really, that's a failure that I had, and what really got me started in this. And after many years of different steels and heat treat processes, developed a steel and then a ferrule material as well that was high strength, to where I could pound through the heaviest of bones and have no damage to the broadhead. So, because of that and the cost of our heads, we had a lifetime, guarantee. You bend or break it, we replace it. We had enough abuse initially with people shooting them into, concrete blocks or into heavy wood over and over, and bending them, getting them out, that we kind of changed the warranty a bit to say any shot at or through an animal, it's warranted. We'll replace it if it gets damaged shooting at or through an animal, even if it hits a rock on the other side of the animal, but in a hunting situation. But we don't want people shooting them. I mean, some people would shoot groups into targets all summer long until all the blades were damaged, and then want to replace with 3-pack. So
Yep.
we just kind of limited it. It doesn't cover target shooting or intentionally shooting at rocks or concrete or steel, but anything in a hunting situation we do cover with warranty.
So it's basically not to reword, but it's some common sense applied to hunting scenarios and making sure you're not smashing broadheads together and shooting stuff that they weren't intended to shoot through. But no, it sounds like a great warranty there, and at least protect the product for what it was intended to do.
Right. We want you to be able to. So they're not single use heads, and that's a new concept for a lot of people. We've had people shoot, and I probably have as well, shoot the same broadhead through several animals, maybe 10 animals, and keep using that broadhead. You typically, might need to touch up the edges to for sharpness after a couple, but you can keep using them. And that's the intention there, is that we want people to know that once you buy them, you can use these for many years. Just take some care with the target shooting and things to not shoot them into something like a steel plate or anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, you talk about after, being able to reuse those, same thing here. And one thing I really loved about them, when I used to use replaceable bladed, more mass produced replaceable bladed broadheads, that was one thing. Like shooting into the target, I could feel, throughout a summer, like these things are getting dull. When you switched over where it's, the iron will, I can just keep shooting, and the thing never, it's, whatever you do to the edge, whatever you've got done with the sharpness there, it's like a foam target really doesn't mess with that. And so I love like being able to get an arrow dialed in with a specific broadhead, knowing that however it's set up is a great combo and it's flying well. I don't have to mess with it. I don't have to worry about sharpening it, because I've shot it 100 times into foam.
Yeah, we generally say if you're going to shoot 5 times, I think I've measured up to 10, but we kind of say if you want to shoot every broadhead arrow, in your quiver and make sure that it's flying well, just shoot once or twice with each arrow at 50 yards or whatever makes you comfortable that arrow is going to fly well. But 5 times or less in like a foam target like Reinhardt Matrix, I can't measure any difference to that edge sharpness. And that's because our hardness is 60 Rockwell C. So that's a very hard, strong edge. And then we do a multi-stage grinding and honing, get it very sharp, and it retains that edge really well. And that's why you can generally shoot through an animal and one pass through of hide, ribs, exiting into just say dirt. You can typically clean it up, see if it's still kind of shaven hair, and put it back in your quiver. Keep using it. And if it does get dull to the point where it's not shaving hair, you pretty quickly touch it up and keep using it too.
Yep. All right. So the next question comes from Chase hopefully I don't mess up the last name, Eagly. Do your vented heads whistle or make noise?
Yeah, in general, vented heads have a little bit of like a like a shish to them, I guess.
Yep.
In flight, our solid heads, I did sound testing years ago, and we just actually repeated it this past year with a study we're doing at the University of Colorado on aero vane designs for improved flight with fixed blade broadheads. And sound recording was part of that. We looked at the sound from the shot to passing through, which would basically be when the animals hit, and then looked at the frequency content as well. And what I would say is that our saw blade heads are very quiet. We saw similar to field point type sound amplitude on those, so they're excellent. And our vented blades are a bit louder. Our original V series with the small vents are probably our loudest head, and then our wide series with the larger vents, that vent is a bit quieter. It's kind of like blowing through a whistle versus a tube a bit there. But we saw in both cases though, and this is why I don't think it's as big of a deal as some people do, is that you get the sound of the bow going off, and then the arrows, and really that bow noise there's still vibration noise coming from that bow when the arrow is 5 to 10 yards downrange already. And then it gets really quiet until the arrow gets pretty close to that animal or the target, and then it flares up. So, and if we looked at the segment that was, say, 15 to 10 yards from the animal, it was very hard to pick up a difference between different vanes, different broadheads, anything there. So I think it's a bit, I don't think it's as big of a concern as some people have. I think that sound from vanes or broadhead blades or vents doesn't really flare up until it's so close to the animal that it's probably not as big a factor as people think.
Yeah, and you may know better than me. I'd have to go research it or Google it. I can't remember the speed of sound versus the speed of a typical arrow. Do you know which one's traveling faster at that point?
Speed of sound, I think, is like 1,200 feet per second, and your arrows,
Yeah, 300. So I mean, that animal is your arrow is never going to outrun the bow. I didn't know the numbers, but I knew this idea that there's no, regardless of that arrow whistling, that animal is going to hear your bow before an arrow ever matters. Yeah, and so it's like in my mind, just comparing the speeds, it's like, all right, that the sound of my bow going off, and with any reasonable archery distance, that animal's been made aware of my bow before he's ever going to recognize the arrow making a whistle.
Yeah, I mean, my current thinking on this, and I try not to make gut decisions. I try to analyze, do data-driven decisions on things, but I kind of feel like, because a lot of people say, from a video, you can see that the animal didn't move at the shot of the bow. He moved from the, sound of the arrow later. But really that arrow is, a quarter of the way there, maybe when he hears it, when he hears the bow go off. And that bow noise continues, for another 5 or 10 yards of that arrow travel.
Yep.
And now he's looking that way. And, deer and animals in general have excellent vision for movement. So he looks over that way. Maybe he sees movement of the hunt or whatever, or maybe even sees the arrow in flight. And then I think with that movement, with that sound, they're deciding, am I going to bolt or not? And they start moving. And, and there's a little bit of time just to register from the sound to when an animal can react. So my feeling is, maybe he moved when the arrow was, maybe started moving when the arrow was halfway there, but it's still that initial sound of the bow, him looking over, maybe something he saw with his vision that's making him react that way. That's kind of my feeling. Not so much the sound of the vane or the broadhead, but that's not the general thinking in industry. I'm just trying to apply science and what I've kind of learned so far.
Yeah, for sure. That's all we can do, right? And that's where I love being able to balance the science versus what we see out there is real world results, and kind of blending those two. So next question comes from Chris Pasto. What's your best practice for sharpening iron will broadheads, or any broadheads for that matter?
Yeah, I would say first off, when you get our broadheads, don't sharpen them. They're very sharp already. It'll be difficult to achieve, the edge sharpness we have. We can zoom into 200x, and it's still, dead sharp to 1/10,000th of an inch. And so our sharpness starts way sharper than many. But in general, I would say that when you get broadheads, it's good to check sharpness. You'd be surprised at how many aren't sharp out of the box, especially like a one-piece solid construction, 2 or 3 blade. Often, a lot of times those just have a milled edge, milled bevels to them. So just a note, first off, when you get heads, check to see if they're sharp. Make sure they're sharp, or sharpen them when you get them. Ours, you shouldn't need to do that. And then it kind of depends on how much that edge is worn away. Generally, with ours, it's kind of like a high-end knife. The hardness, the sharpness is very good to start with, and you can typically go through, hide, meat, even a rib, and have that edge be pretty good. So I would first just clean it up, check and see if it's still sharp, shaven hair, or you can see if it kind of cuts paper. If it's good, just leave it. If the edges still look good, you don't see any flats or rolled edge or anything like that, but it's not quite shaving hair, cutting paper, then I just and there's videos on our YouTube channel that show this, but I just start with like an extra fine stone, and by hand kind of hold the bevel, to kind of match the bevel, just tip it slightly so that I'm contacting the edge, and just, a few strokes back and forth, over and over, and then lightning pressure. And really it's about a minute and a half of doing that on an edge, and I'm typically able to shave hair again. If it's been dulled, I guess, more than that, then that's when I guess the foolproof kind of way to do it, I think, is to remove the blade, clamp it into a knife sharpener, or a broadhead jig, but put a marker on the beveled edge. And then I like the knife sharpeners where you can set the angle and have flat stones, so you can adjust the angle until just one light kind of scrape against that stone is removing that marker that you put on all the way to the edge. So you're kind of matching the bevel, cleaning up to the edge.
Yep.
And then you can you maybe just start with a fine and then extra fine, or if it's a bit more beat up, you might go medium fine, extra fine. But you're taking strokes on one side and then the other, back and forth, and kind of regrinding that edge all the way to the tip. As you can go to finer stones, you can get a finer, sharper edge. And we can get into more details on this, but as you're doing it initially, you want to clean up that edge to where you can feel a burr all along that edge coming out to the other side. Then you clean up that full edge. And you're doing it back then on the other side to bring it back. And then as you go to the finer stones, you're kind of working a smaller burr. And then at the end, it's you're just taking it completely off, and it's dead sharp.
Yeah, I like to use, I've had a few broadheads get to that point. A lot of times I can just pick it up, flip my thumb across it. It's still really sharp, good enough to shoot another animal with. But yeah, when I get to that point, I don't remember the kind, but it's a work sharp that basically, rotate your blade 180. You can set the exact angle you want. So I just kind of look at the side, make sure that, I'm contacting the tip, but I'm also kind of maintaining that angle. So I'm getting a real smooth, and then just, run it down the blade. It holds it at the perfect, 22 and a half, whatever it may be for a double bevel, or whatever that angle may be. And then, you can touch them up really good. I do notice that, like, the since you do get it to a hardness of 60, it sometimes can be a little bit more difficult than I would say like a cheaper steel to get that. You have to work out a little bit more, but I found that work sharp lets me get those things dialed right back in without removing too much material, and kind of maintaining that angle really well.
Yeah, it's A2 tool steel, so it's a steel used in metal stamping dies to cut other metals, and it kind of has a unique ability to have great impact toughness and retain an edge, and sharpness even when cutting through something like metal. I'd say it's a pretty workable steel since it's a tool steel. It doesn't have it's not like some super steels that have such hard carbide particles in it that it's really difficult, or you need special stones or equipment to sharpen. I'd say it's definitely doable with standard sharpening stones, but it would take a little bit more work than say a soft 420 something
Yeah,
like
yes. I know it's not near as difficult as like the S30Vs, S90Vs and stuff we used to try to sharpen. I'm like, man, I can't remember how to run a knife sharpener anymore because you'd sit and struggle with those, and then eventually figured out how to get those sharp again. But yeah, it's definitely easier than that, but maybe a little more work than softer steels. So
Yes.
the next question comes from AJ Doobie. How much helical for a single bevel would you recommend?
Yeah, I kind of like 2 to 3 degrees. And this is part of the university study too. We were looking at with a high-speed camera as the arrow comes out of the bow and how quickly does it spin up, and then what's the maximum spin it gets downrange. And so I mean, I don't like 0 to 1 degree. I mean, 0 definitely you're not getting any rotation, and the reason you want rotation in an arrow is it kind of averages out any asymmetries. If your insert or broadhead is pointing a little bit off to one side, and then you just shoot the arrow without rotation, it's just going to drive the arrow off to that direction. Whereas if you have rotation, it might open up your groups a little bit, but it's going to keep it much closer to on the bullseye. So you want rotation, and I think 2 to 3 degrees is a pretty good amount, I think, on a vane to relatively quickly spin that arrow up so you get the accuracy advantages. But I don't really see a need to get a very high rotation. I think at impact, super high rotation, it seems like it'd probably be a negative thing. But what I've tested I've tested like 2.5 to 3 degree helical with our current single bevels, and that seems to do a really good job. We've got high speed video on our YouTube channel actually of passing through a deer, and you can see that the arrow is rotating at impact, and it just keeps rotating right through that animal. Doesn't miss a beat there with a single bevel head. So yeah, I like the 2 to 3 degree range for shooting really any fixed blade broadhead, but definitely seems to work well with single bevels too.
Gotcha. And I'm going to piggyback on AJ's question. Some of this stuff I don't claim to be an expert on. I've shot helical, right-handed twist, double bevel broadhead. So I haven't had to deal with a lot of this, but single bevels are sold left or right twist, right? And then you've got the ability to helical left or right, but then you've also got the idea that a bow naturally wants to spin an arrow a certain direction. So we take those three things that could all work together, could work apart from each other, or you could have two working in one direction, one in the other. What's your opinion on that? Should we go to, because it's something I've never thought of, nothing I've ever went through. When I was growing up bow hunting, it was always about you don't want to spin the arrow so that it wants to loosen your broadhead, or the ferrule from the insert. And so you always, everything's spun to the, you wanted your arrow spin to the right, kind of kept your broadhead locked in. What's your take, your opinion? Is there any research that supports those things should all match? How do we figure it out? I know it's a lot all in one question, but if you can kind of elaborate on that whole idea.
Yeah, I think the important thing, or the most important thing, if you're going to shoot single bevel, is that your vanes and your bevel match. You want that arrow rotation as it hits the animal to continue in that direction. So, and I think you can I'd say 2 to 3 degree offset or helical. And if you're doing right offset or helical, then do a right single bevel. If you're doing left offset or helical, just do a left single bevel, because you want that rotational momentum that's providing some of the torque to go through the animal, which is kind of needed with single bevel. Single bevel, all that pressure on that bevel causes the rotation as you go through the animal, but you don't want it to stop that rotation and have to change direction and go back the other way. You lose energy and penetration there. So that's the most important part of this whole thing. The other question is really the kind of the clocking, they call it, of the bow. Or if you shoot a bear shaft out of your bow, which way is that arrow going to rotate? And this isn't really done by design. I mean, ideally the arrow would just come straight out of a bow. The bow manufacturers aren't doing something in particular to make it rotate left or right. There's just kind of an imbalanced force on it that might go left or right. And generally that's due to the string twist and the serving and how that knock just kind of releases from it. I first heard about this maybe 12 years ago or so, and when I first tested it on my bow at that time, I was getting like a 1/4 inch rotation left over 12 feet. Well, I knew from high-speed video that my arrow was getting like a full rotation right in like 10 inches or something from the vanes when they're at 2.5 to 3 degrees. So, and from engineering, some of the torques equals I alpha. It's that rotational angular acceleration, I guess. So to me, like that little bit of torque left and all this torque right from the vane, don't worry about it. That was kind of my initial thoughts on it, and I've still kind of tell people in general, it's not a big of a factor. I mean, if you want to really dig into the details and the weeds, I do see with high speed video that if the bow tends to want to make it rotate a little bit left, there's a little bit more of a hesitation there before the right rotation starts. So I'm not going to say that it doesn't matter at all, but I'm not so sure that I don't think it probably matters a whole lot in accuracy, at least not for the average guy. And I'm not even sure for the pros. I've talked to pros that started doing it, but they said they aren't really seeing a difference in accuracy. So yeah. I'm a bit on the fence on that whole thing, but it's one of those details that there's a lot of other things to worry about. There are bigger factors than that.
Yep. All right, yeah, thanks for diving into that one for me. So the next question comes from Ryan Randall. Are there any plans for a traditional 3 or 4 blade head in Iron Will's future?
Yeah, good question. Our 2 blade with bleeders is basically a 4 blade with an advantage, I think. Putting that bleeder back away from the tip is an improvement for splitting bone, for instance. If you're, and it's really why I like a 2 blade with bleeders over a 3 blade as well. If you think about hitting a scapula with a 2 blade head, it just has to make one split through it. And that takes quite a bit less force than like a 3 blade where you're splitting in 3 different directions at once. It's a lot more force. And we've got some force testing data on our website that shows this, but just pushing down through hide muscle and scapula with our 2 blade with bleeders versus a 3 blade, I think the force was like 5 times as much with that 3 blade, trying to make that split out 3 ways. And I hear about this all the time, people shooting a 3 blade head into scapula on an elk and not penetrating through, where ours penetrates very easily through. So will I ever make a 3 blade? I might. I'm considered it. There's a lot of people that are just stuck on shooting 3 blade heads and want me to make a better one. And so I might, but I actually think a 2 blade with bleeders is a better option for still getting a nice entrance exit hole, cutting a similar amount of tissue if you look at the total cut, but yet it penetrates bone and hide and everything else much better.
Yep. No, I'm in agreement there. The only advantage I ever saw to a 3 blade was the idea that hole may not, it may stay more open, but I think we still accomplish that. Like you said, the tension from the center of that hole on a 4 blade does the same thing and kind of keeps that hole open. But then, people have talked about, well, just basically 2 blades crossing, they can still close. But I agree, you kind of get that middle open. So, yeah, thanks for taking that one on. And now the last question. The question we had got from a few guys is, why are they so expensive? And I'd like to rearrange this question and ask you, why are Iron Wills worth what you charge for them? And if you can go through the manufacturing process, QA/QC, materials, finishing, hardening, all of that, and kind of give us a look into why these broadheads cost what they cost.
Yeah, good question. When I first had a broadhead fail on an elk shoulder blade in 2004. And it was pretty devastating for me at the time. And, I was a mechanical engineer, had developed products for other companies for many years at a high level. And then I took a look at this broadhead, really critically, and decided quickly that this thing's junk. It's prone to failure. And I really just decided, well, I first, researched and tested a lot of other heads out there, but then at the end decided to really just start from scratch and not think about low-cost manufacturing, but think about how can I get the highest possible performance out of this broadhead to for sure get to an elk shoulder bone, get through the vitals, make that a successful hunt instead of, a heartbreak. And, I'd also had a background when I first graduated from engineering school, I went to work for 3M company. At the time with development engineers, they'd have you spend like 20% of your time on a technology development project. And coming out of school, I kind of had an emphasis in kind of mechanical design, machine design, but then also advanced materials engineering and steels in particular. So the technology development program they gave me was tooling technology development for the corporation. So I was digging heavily into steels, tool steels, heat treats, coatings, other things to try and improve tools that we're doing, cutting materials, cutting metals, really kind of all the different tooling things that are used in a big manufacturing corporation. So, I dug deep into the steels, worked with different steel suppliers and things like that. So I had that background as well. So, I just knew there was that, most of the blades out there were using like a 420 stainless steel, which is not really even a good blade steel. It's kind of a nice compromise of being very cheap and doing okay. But anyway, I went through 5 different steels before I settled on A2 tool steel. I used S7 as well, which is a great impact steel. And really, they're both used in metal stamping dies and punches. S7 is generally used to punch or form metal. A2 is often used if you're going to cut metal. And so even though I liked S7 and used it for a couple years in development, I decided A2 was kind of a better because I could get it harder, sharper, retain the edge better. Anyway, and I process it like you would a high-end knife blade. We start with steel plate, blank that out. We do CNC machining, multi-stage grinding, honing. We do a heat treat process that includes a cryogenic treatment and triple tempering to just get the best possible. We can geek out on why we do that, but you do this cryogenic treatment, you make sure all the, it's basically making sure the microstructure is perfectly, changed, goes from austenite to martensite, and it's a very hard, dense structure, and to make sure it's all uniform. And then the tempering adds the toughness. Anyway, we spent a year just working on the heat treat once we chose the steel. And so all these steps in that process, add cost versus typical blades they're done on a reel to reel. There's a reel of metal coming in one side, and you can do that when blades are, 20, 30, maybe even 35, 40 thou thick. You can just have a roll of steel coming into a stamping machine to where it's feeding through on a strip. It's stamped, and a lot of these machines, they grind it right, they sharpen it right there too. They stamp, run through a one-side grinder. It comes off the other side of the machine, and these parts these blades cost dimes to make versus dollars to make. So anyway, that's kind of why ours is more expensive. And that's, kind of explain the blades. Our ferrules, we use a grade 5 titanium for our lighter heads, and that's really the best strength to weight ratio of any metal. So I think that's the best metal to use on a ferrule on, say, a 100 grain head. We use it on some of our 100, 125 grain heads when you really want the best strength to weight ratio. And then as we go to our heavier weights, we use a hardened steel, which is, all steels aren't created equal. Most steel, all steel, say ferrules or heads out there are generally 302 stainless, which is not hardened. You can use martensitic steel, harden it, and get strength that's, maybe 2 to 3 times the strength of those austenitic, 300 series steels. So, and we actually harden them and machine them in the hardened state. So it requires that we machine them slower. It takes longer to machine. The material costs more. So that's why those cost more as well. But we can get very precise. There's no, distortion or discoloration from a later heat treat. And it's really kind of the best way to make the parts that you can. And I'm all about performance. I'm a development engineer, and I want to use the best process to make the best product, and kind of let the costs fall where they do. And that's really why our broadheads cost quite a bit.
Yeah, and I'm the same way, sometimes with our calls, it's like, let's just design the best call we can and roll up the cost of goods and figure out where that thing needs to be profitable, and we've let that lead a lot of our projects. But yeah, for me, and not to over dramatize it, but we spend, not trying to justify, you basically gave us the reason on the price. But for me, as a user of your product, you spend all year for the most part planning, thinking, setting up for these hunts, your one or two archery elk hunts, because you can only, maybe 3 max to squeeze these in. You drive potentially all over the country, you drive across your state, or you're driving into your unit and you've bought new this or that. Like, when it comes down to it, like, do I want to risk the chance that, when I'm at full draw, knowing, the last thing I want to think about is if, is this broadhead going to perform, or if I make a slightly less than perfect shot, like, is it, am I still covered? Like, is the broadhead going to be, and for me, it's easy just to, like, peace of mind knowing that I've got the best broadhead that I've been able to find, on the tip of my arrow.
Yeah, that's a good point. All the effort, all the work, to be a bow hunter, there's a lot of preparation and work that goes into it. And when that shot happens on that animal that walks out, and maybe it's the biggest animal you've seen or whatever, but when that animal walks out, what piece of gears matter the most? Well, at that point, it's having good arrow flight and then having your broadhead perform, on impact. So
Yep.
it's, our heads are probably $20 more per head than the things you're going to pick up at a department store. But it's, to me, is worth it at that moment of truth there, to get that animal and have the best chance for success.
Yeah. Well, that kind of wraps up the listener questions here. I appreciate everybody over Is It September Yet sending us questions. And so, once again, you have questions of your own, email them to us at ctd@phelpsgamecalls.com, or send us a social message and we'll do our best to include them for me or my guests. So now we're going to jump into kind of my discussion I wanted to have with you, Bill. On Cutting the Distance, we're all about tips and tactics, and I think it's important to kind of, and to become successful, but I believe it's easy to kind of roll broadheads into, finding success, and, being able to technical data surrounds them, the lethality of the broadheads. And so, glad to have you on here. I got a few of my own, and I love when things are based on science and data. We're coming off of a few interviews with biologists. Like, I just love being able to look at the data and figure out, does this correlate with what I've seen? Are there anomalies? Are there reasons why what I've seen are different than the data? And just, like, let the chips fall where they do, and go with that. But you are, similar to me. We've got the engineering side, but then we go out and test all of our products. And I want to see those real world results that support or back up what's found in, and what I believe, what I've been able to find. And I think you and what you're doing with Iron Will broadheads kind of, encapsulates that whole idea. Design the best broadheads on paper, do a bunch of testing, and then go out and confirm them on animals. So, gonna jump into our conversation with you here. So can we dive a little deeper into your work that you're doing with the University of Colorado? I think there's a lot of just generalities or ideas that have, come from many, many years of bow shop owners and industry stuff. But you're actually going back and kind of proving that, or, coming up with data that supports that. So give us a little bit of what you're doing at University of Colorado. You've got new vanes that you're looking at, new arrow setups. Kind of give us the full rundown of lab testing and new products.
Yeah, so to give you a little background there, I developed products for other companies for many years, and I was always seeking out the best, engineering tools, really, whether it was computer modeling, instrumentation, high-speed camera, accelerometers, just whatever kind of instrumentation, analysis tools, really kind of the best engineering tools, and applying them to improve products. Engineering is really applying science to, solve problems or develop better products. But at the companies I worked for, I always, really drove highest level engineering improvements. And through years of doing that, I was leading engineering teams and, really kind of mentoring and driving other people to do the, apply science, do the analysis, but then also do some lab testing to kind of prove that a computer model is accurate, and this what the analysis shows will be an improvement actually does make an improvement, and then in the final assembly testing, prove out that you did make it better. And so I was involved, in different companies doing that, and then companies I worked for started sponsoring university projects, and then I was placed as kind of the company, industry client over those projects. And then about 8 years ago, the university asked me to be one of the faculty directors, so I became an adjunct instructor of mechanical engineering, and was one of the faculty directors for the senior design project for mechanical engineering. And that's a year-long project where seniors mechanical engineering are required to do it, but they take an industry project and spend a year doing, analysis, design analysis, prototyping, testing, iterating, bring it to manufacturing typically. So I've been, teaching students kind of best practices for mechanical engineering, and trying to kind of bridge that gap between, okay, you have all the school knowledge and all the tests you've taken, all the information is there. Now, how do you, solve the problem when you have all the information? That's generally what happens in university tests. To where you get in the real world and develop a project, and all the information isn't given to you. You have to figure out, what is the science here? What is the physics? How can I apply it? How can I analyze it, test it? So, I've been teaching students to do that. And then this past year, I finally got approval from the university to both direct and sponsor a project. So Iron Wall Outfitters is sponsoring a project on improved arrow vane design for bow hunting, with fixed blade broadheads on the front. So it's been a great project. It was 5 seniors in mechanical engineering that had no background in, archery or bow hunting, which I kind of like. They come into it with no, preconceived ideas of what works or doesn't work. They're just designing, analyzing, collecting data, and really kind of making data-driven, decisions, or showing the results based on that. So this past year, we tested 6 of what I considered kind of the top hunting vanes in the industry. Did a CAD model of those at a 3-degree helical on the arrow with iron broadheads on the front. Did a fluid dynamic model. So it's really a very sophisticated one. It has airflow going over the arrow, even as it's rotating through the air. We were able to model that. We're looking at really accuracy, stability, wind drift, drag, and sound from that. So we can model all that here. We can I don't know if I said spin up as well. So we can kind of model that, how these different vanes will do a better job of that than the other. We can tip the angle at, say, 5 degrees to the wind, like as if it's coming out of your bow and your bow's a little untuned. And we can see what is the restoring torque that quickly brings that arrow back on track to get it, straight at the target. And so we studied 6 of the vanes in the industry, and then studied some different prototype vanes. But we took it from the analytical computer modeling to then also to do the empirical testing, the actual testing with a shooting machine, using a high-speed camera to kind of verify the spin up, and then the stabilizing, and then the max rotation. We used lab radar to look at the velocity from the bow to the target to verify the drag and the drop that we calculated through the model. We had a very sophisticated sound recording system placed out there that was recording the sound with these omnidirectional microphones. And then we analyzed that through MATLAB, so we could look at the frequency content. And we looked at the frequency kind of peak range for humans, which I think was 2 to 4 kilohertz, and then also animals, which I believe was 4 to 8 kilohertz. So we said, okay, does this arrow sound, arrow broadhead vane combination sound loud to a person? And also, does it sound loud to an animal? Is it more likely to make an animal react or not? So we took all that data. We just kind of finished up the project. We're going to plan to put out some kind of white papers to summarize that. But that's that's kind of just the overview of the project. And really the reason I wanted to sponsor that is I feel like with the broadhead development, I have a broadhead now that is, penetrating really well through hide bone. It's getting you that pass through. And a lot of people, I wouldn't say a lot, but some people, their problem with shooting fixed blade heads is that they struggle to get good arrow flight with fixed blade heads. So I wanted to dig more into the science there and kind of be able to show people, hey, you can definitely get great long range flight with fixed blade heads. You just need to do a few things here. Get some rotation in your arrow, tuned bow, the right vanes on the back, and you're good.
Gotcha. Yeah, I like it, and I'm excited to see what comes out on that white paper, and if it changes anything that we think is right as of right now. My next question for you is, what's your opinion on FOC? Did the pendulum swing too far? Does it matter? We've went to this, all your weight in the first 2 inches. Like, just give me your take on that and what you've found, or what your opinion is on if there's a compromise where we don't have to chase these huge FOC numbers.
Yeah, I don't think there's any science that would show that extreme FOC would be a significant increase in penetration. If you, I mean, the science and the math, the physics and the math there is that momentum is going to equal force times time. Change of momentum will equal force times time. Momentum is a vector quantity, so it has a direction. And momentum is mass times velocity. So really the way to maximize your penetration is to maximize that mass times velocity in a straight line. So having good arrow flight so that your arrow is going straight as it impacts the animal, and then have that increased mass and or velocity can give you that total increased mass times total increased momentum at impact. It's going to translate into how much force can that really arrow system apply as it cuts through, and for how long. So it's that product of force times time. So there's no FOC in the math or the physics there. There's no center of mass in that calculation. I think it only comes into effect if it's somehow changing how well your arrow is flying or what it's doing at impact. So I think the advantages with FOC, they improve stability. As you move your center of mass a bit forward, you're going to improve your stability. But I personally don't go to any extremes. I think, say, 12 to 15, 16% is great. I've seen excellent penetration. My arrow setups are usually in that 12 to 15% range. And I can tell you through all my testing, with the right broadhead on the front, you have excellent penetration. So I don't see a need for this extreme FOC. The physics doesn't really justify that. I think that Dr. Ed Ashby's testing, I've talked to him about this. He saw now going from a 19 to, I think it was 22% FOC, saw 30% improvement in penetration. I really think that's because he's shooting a longbow at close range, and there's a lot of flexing in that arrow, and it probably improved his arrow flight, or how straight that arrow was on impact, and that was probably a majority of the factor for penetration. And I think it's unfortunate. I think a lot of people have tried to apply that to modern compound bows, and the negative they do is to try and get extreme FOC. They're often underspined, putting that a lot of mass out in front. You don't have the arrow stiffness to support it. You get massive flexing back and forth. And I see this on YouTube videos of people that are extreme FOC, advocates. You can see in their arrow flight, that thing's flexing back and forth like crazy. And in my arrow setups, I may be getting like a half inch of vertical flex of the arrow, and then it's almost going perfectly straight, 10 feet later.
Yeah.
I don't want to have that massive flexing back and forth all the way to the target. That's going to reduce penetration because your momentum it's not in a straight line anymore
Yeah.
at that point.
No, I'm in that same camp, and and then you're like, all right, well, mass is included, so do I just go to a heavy arrow? But then you're once again, if you're chasing heavy arrow and FOC, you end up with an underspined arrow, or you end up with, you end up with a heavy weight, but now you've just given up velocity, which all calculates back into, it's really just a trade off, and that's where you look at it, and then you also factor in what you saw from maybe some of the female bow hunters you've hunted with that got perfect pass throughs at 52 pounds and a 420 grain arrow or whatever it is, and you're like, well, what am I doing as a guy shooting a 72 pound bow and full length arrows 560 grain? It's like, does it all matter, or do we just need to be able to shoot our bows better, and hit the animal right where we want? And I build my arrows somewhat backwards, and I fall into that same 12 to 15% FOC like you do, just kind of naturally. I've got a fairly long draw. I shoot full length 32-inch arrows. And then I just kind of keep stuffing weight in the front until I get my bow to what it says on paper is going to shoot about 280 to 285 feet per second, and just confirm that I'm spined right, and then I move on. I'm not chasing a weight. I'm chasing more of a speed. What does that weight and that tip weight got to do? And then make sure my spine's still in, is correct, and I'm not going to be, over spined, and just kind of leave it there. Like I build backwards to a speed that I like to shoot, and don't chase FOC or a crazy weighted arrow. Just by my size, I end up with a 550 to 560 grain arrow, but it's just because of the 32-inch draw length and heavy arrows.
Yeah, there's definitely a trade-off there. As you increase the mass, your trajectory drops off. And so people ask me, what weight should I go with to maximize penetration? Well, I think you do continue to see improvements with penetration with mass, especially, and the technical reason for this, I think, is because is an animal tissue and everything probably acts a bit like viscoelastic material, where it's like as you increase that shear rate, it takes more force. So a light, fast arrow is going to take more force to go through at that higher speed, and it's going to slow down easier because it's light versus a heavier arrow. And so, but it's not that huge of a factor. So I think I kind of calculated in my setup, I thought 100 grains, say going from 450 to 550, might be maybe a 10% improvement in penetration, maybe not quite that much really. But
yeah.
But then there's a drop off in trajectory as well. And that's why I'm typically end up around 500 grains. But it's why I'm not going 600 plus, because I just get way too much drop off in the trajectory. And having good arrow flight and hitting where you're aiming are really number one.
Yeah, for sure.
And as far as where to put the weight, yeah, up front's better than putting it. You don't really want to put it at the back. And up front's better than having just a heavy arrow with a light head up front. I wouldn't go with a heavy arrow and then only have 100 grains or 116 up front, like some people will do with just a aluminum insert and a 100 grain head. And then your FOC's down at 10% or below. I think say, the recommendations out there in the industry are maybe 10 to 12% for target setups and like 12 to 14 for hunting arrow setups. I think that's what like Easton has said before. I don't like going all the way down to 10 or below. You add the possibility for instability with a fixed blade head. So that's really the reason for having some mass up front and having a decent FOC, but there's no need to go extreme, in my opinion. It's more likely to hurt arrow flight and trajectory.
Yeah. This kind of segue or kind of plays off of what we were just talking about. Do you have much research on, the cutting diameter in relation to penetration? And one thing I've always did, which surprises some people, is I just shoot 100 grain solid head. I want the smallest cutting diameter as possible. Now I want that broadhead to be sharp and do all the other things, but I've always in my head just added weight to my insert or whatnot, because I wanted the ultimate penetration. As I mentioned earlier, I've always been in that camp that I want a hole on both sides. I also, if I do encounter bone, I've always thought that a 1-inch cutting diameter is easier to push through that bone than an inch and, an eighth or an inch and a quarter. Do you have any data on cutting diameter in relation to penetration, and if my thought process is right or if it's incorrect?
Well, I totally agree with you that getting that exit holes is important, and cutting all the way through getting the exit hole. And I like to shoot our standard width heads on elk. They have like 1.16" main blade, 3/4 inch bleeder. It's 1.8 inches total cut, but it's relatively compact and flies well at long range. And that's generally my elk head. And I'm zipping right through that. It takes such low force to cut through with their heads that often they're going 20 yards and looking around, or sometimes not even moving. It's zipping through and they're dying quickly if with the right shot placement. So I don't really see a need to go with bigger heads. And for years, I kind of fought it. And then we had enough people that really just wanted a wider head for whitetails, bears, things where the shots are closer. And long range flight isn't so important, and just to get a bigger hole. When I first started making those and doing all the lab testing, I expected to see quite a bit higher force to penetrate with the wider blades. And I was a bit surprised that I don't measure much difference. And it's really kind of helped reinforce what I'd learned prior, is that sharpness and edge retention are huge factors in the force it takes to penetrate, especially in hide and muscle and tissue. But it seems to be in scapula as well. Now, I might say if bigger, heavier bone, you're probably gonna have less force to cut through with a head that's not quite so wide. But if I just measure the force to go through, say hide, muscle, and like the thin part of scapula, man, I have a hard time measuring a difference between our standard head and our wide, which is 1 3/8 wide main blade, 3/4 inch bleeder for 2 1/8 inch total cut. So I've kind of changed my thinking a little bit, and I don't see any problem with using that head on, deer and elk. I use it a lot, but I also started using it on elk when I have a setup where it might be over water, or I know the shot's going to be relatively close. It penetrates. I put one through a bull last year, exited the opposite side shoulder bone, and then buried into a log 8 inches on the other side of the elk. So even though it's wide, it went through, it wasn't the thin part, it wasn't the knuckle, it was kind of in between part of the shoulder bone, but it didn't really slow down. I think once the tip starts cutting away, and maybe on bone split, it's kind of split that far already, and maybe on the hide, once you start cutting, it doesn't take that much to keep cutting it a little wider. But I do think in general in the industry, if you look at broadheads beyond ours, the more cutting, the wider cutting you do, takes more force, and is probably going to give you less penetration in general.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's okay. Perfect. That's kind of what I thought, but it's that idea that it's gonna, in my head, it's gonna work if I hit it in the right spot and don't go through heavy bone. The 1 inch is still, or the 1 16 still gonna do its job, but for the and I went through right through the middle of the scapula before and broke through, but it's that instance like, all right, I maybe have to go through there, or I miss just a little bit and go through there. I feel like it just gives me a little more margin of error, but as you're saying, maybe not as much as we thought due to the the construction of the tip and how everything's working on those iron wills.
Yeah, one thing I'd point out too is that our newest head now is a wide single bevel head that we've had a lot of people asking us for, and I've been testing that over the last year. And just a few weeks ago, I was in Texas hunting hogs with it, and one hog, kind of a older boar that I shot a little further forward than I intended to. It was a 40-yard shot, or some leaves covering his head, and I ended up shooting too far forward. I went right through the knuckle on that hog, and that was probably 2.5 inches of solid bone, and it was a loud crack. And I thought, oh no, I hit something really hard. This will be a real test for that wide single bevel that's trying to rotate, through the bone too.
Yeah.
But it made it through the bone and got, all the way through the animal. The arrow didn't completely pass through, but the broadhead made an exit on their side, and that bone just cut clean in two, where you could just kind of pull it apart like a puzzle, put it back together. It was a slice all the way through, and so that was with our wide head. So again, I feel like it's going to, you need the right steel, the right hardness, strength, and everything to be able to cut through that bone. But it was good to see that even with the wide, we went through probably the thickest bone you're going to see on an animal in North America.
Gotcha. Yeah, I had a question here coming up that would have been a great segue. Single bevel versus double bevel. We kind of exhausted that on the listener questions, but are you seeing the ability? This is my last question on single. Once again, bone are you seeing a difference? Does that single bevel just have the ability to kind of torque its way through and rotate its way through bone better than double bevel, or is that tonneau point on the double bevel able to break through bone similar, or is there an advantage of one to the other?
Yeah, great question. And over many years of testing, I've kind of struggled to find a difference for bone splitting ability. I know that was it's set out there a lot that the single bevels rotate and pop bone apart. I've talked to Dr. Ashby directly about that, and how my results were a bit different. And he was using a very long, like 3-to-1 ratio head. He had a very slow longbow setup, and he was seeing where double bevel could kind of just kind of wedge into that bone and take more force to penetrate versus that single bevel. As it started rotating, it was kind of popping bone and reducing the force for him to penetrate. It was an improvement. Um, and I think, and I've talked to this with him a number of times now, and I feel like with my setup being a modern compound bow, I had so much more energy that when the tip of in our tonto tip shape, when that enters the bone, starts piercing that bone, it's popping it apart, it's cutting it apart very quickly, and doing a great job penetrating. And that single bevel, as it's cutting in and popping it apart, you know, it's hard for me to see a difference in that, at least with my setup and my levels of energy. It might be more of a factor with a lower energy setup, thicker bones, but I'm generally not seeing it. I'm popping through. I do a lot of testing on, you know, cattle femurs, things like that, and I'm seeing them both are popping through with no problem.
Gotcha. So this will be my last question for you. You kind of rolled it up a little bit, for elk when you're in close proximity, but we got a lot of whitetail hunters out there. So for setting up for elk, what would you recommend the best broadhead for whitetail hunters, to be, out of a tree stand, if that changes angles and all of that? Do you have a recommendation for that, or is it just typically your wider angles?
Yeah, I've shot all of our broadheads on quite a few whitetails at this point, and I could say that they all do a good job. They all zip through quickly, cut through bones, open up shot angles and opportunities there. That's really kind of what I tell people that might shoot mechanical or want to know how is our head better than a mechanical at a whitetail. I'm generally telling them it's opening up shot angles, and if you shoot a mechanical, hit them where they're soft and you're probably fine. But with ours, if that animal ducks and turns into it and you have to go through the shoulder blade, even the thickest part of the shoulder bone, it's going to penetrate, and it's going to get you through the vitals. Or if it's a downward shot through the spine, and really I'd say that about any of our heads that we make, they're all going to be able to make those shots. I'm generally personally using our wides now more on whitetails. It's just that the shots are, typically 20 to 30 yards. Rarely are they over 40 in a whitetail woods. And so I know our wide's going to penetrate great. Why not get a little bigger hole? If there's a more marginal shot, let's say you end up hitting, one lung, liver, guts. I've done that a number of times, and with our wide bevel with that 2/8 inch total cut between the main blade and the bleeder, often they're going maybe 60, 70 yards and dying, even with a single lung, liver shot. It's just doing enough trauma that they're going down quickly. So that's kind of the advantage of why shoot maybe a wide over a smaller one, is just more, more bleeding, potentially quicker kills. So that's what I generally recommend on whitetails, our wide series, and that's what I generally recommend on bears as well, which are similar, closer shots, and bears, especially with all that hair, it's important to get an exit hole there. That's talking to the outfitter again in Canada a few weeks back. A lot of guys are coming up there shooting mechanicals, and if they're a little bit quartered away and hitting the opposite side shoulder, they're not getting pass throughs, and then they got a high entrance hole, no exit hole. And on a bear, that means no blood trail, because it just soaks up that blood so much. So whitetails, bears, I generally recommend our wide heads for those shots.
Gotcha. Yeah, thanks for that. Bill, tell everybody how they can follow along, follow the company on social media, check out more. And if there's anything else you'd like to throw in that we didn't cover here, feel free to do that as well.
Yeah, our website is Ironwell Outfitters. We're on Instagram, Facebook is Ironwell Outfitters. Also, we have a YouTube channel. It's also Ironwell Outfitters. And I'm committed to improving bow hunting, applying science to make better products. We make broadheads. You're currently working on making better arrows. We've started, through the university study, we came up with, we found the best thing from the study was this hybrid hunter vane, which is the Max Hunter profile and a new hybrid material that we had AE make for us, and worked with Easton to machine flex these at 3-degree helical, so that all the people ask me, what arrow setup should I use with your broadheads? I can just say, hey, the one we sell right now kind of did the best overall in the study. And we know this is going to work well to make our heads fly well. And really, if you have a bow tune, so your arrow's coming relatively straight off of it, you're properly spined, and then you have enough vane on the back to stabilize that fixed blade head on the front. You should have good arrow flight. And we have great tech support. If people are having any problems with our broadheads in flight, we're happy to help you get that set up. But I want to throw that out there too, that I want to help the bow hunters be more successful, and we're happy to help you do that.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Bill. Thanks for jumping on. Good luck this fall if I don't talk to you before then. And always appreciate your knowledge and perspective, and your opinions, whatever you may throw at this, because I know you've tested it and confirmed it. So I really appreciate having you on, and take care.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. It's good talking to another engineer. And I know I might have got a little bit too into the details, but hopefully people have some takeaways from it. But yeah, thanks a lot for having me on.
Yep. Thank you. Take care.